He called her useless. He called her a burden. He filed for divorce because he thought she contributed nothing to his empire. But when the papers were signed, she smiled and revealed the truth. She didn't just own the billion-dollar luxury real estate company, she had always owned it, his entire fortune, built on her foundation. Before we go any further, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or erased from your own story, please like this video. Subscribe right now because the next 20 minutes might change how you see karma, power, and the people closest to you. Let me take you back to Manhattan. It's the late 1990s. The real estate market is booming. The luxury hospitality world is exploding. And in the most prestigious circles, two people meet at a charity gala. His name is David Rothstein, 58 years old now, but back then he was charming, ambitious, and hungry. He wore his ambition like cologne. Everyone could smell it. She was Grace Johnson, elegant, quiet, from old money, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Her family had built their fortune in luxury accommodations and real estate investments over generations. They knew the game. They knew the players. They knew what actually made buildings, brands, and billions. When David met Grace that night, he was working as a mid-level property manager. When he smiled at her, he wasn't just smiling at a beautiful woman, he was smiling at a door. And Grace, because she was kind and because she believed in people, opened it. But here's what nobody knew. Grace didn't just fall in love with David, she educated him, she mentored him, she taught him things that took her family decades to learn. She showed him how to read markets, how to understand the psychology of luxury clients, how to design spaces that made people feel like they belonged to something elite. She introduced him to her network, the kind of network that money can't buy, only inherit. The builders, the architects, the investors, the old families who controlled real estate in New York, Miami, and beyond. They married quickly. Grace was radiant. David was already planning. Within a year, they launched a business together. It was called Rothstein Luxury Properties. The name on the door was his. The vision, the strategy, the connections, the capital, that was her. But something shifts in a marriage when one person starts taking all the credit. It happens slowly. You don't notice it at first. The first time David did an interview without mentioning Grace, it was just an oversight. The second time it was the interviewer's fault for not asking. By the 5th time, by the 10th time, by the 100th time, it wasn't an oversight anymore. It was a choice. I've learned something about powerful men. The ones who are truly self-made, they acknowledge their mentors, they credit their partners. But the ones who are afraid that they're not actually that smart, not actually that capable, they erase the people who helped them. Because the moment you admit someone else was essential, you admit you're not the genius. And David couldn't live with that. Years passed. Grace watched her ideas become David's innovations. She watched her market research become his expertise. She watched her connections become his network. And she watched him fall in love with another woman while he was still married to her. Her name was Victoria, 29 years old. She worked in their office. She laughed at his jokes. She looked at him like he was a king. And for a man like David, a man who needed to be seen as a genius, as irreplaceable, as the sole architect of his own success, Victoria was intoxicating. Grace noticed. Of course she noticed. She's not the type to miss things. But instead of crying or confronting him, she did something else. She started documenting. She took photographs of the business plans she'd created. She kept emails where she outlined strategy. She photographed her own handwriting in notebooks filled with ideas, her ideas, that had been presented to clients with David's name attached. She wasn't gathering evidence for spite. She was gathering evidence for truth. Then came the interview. It was in a major business magazine. David was their cover story. The Self-Made Billionaire, How David Rothstein Built an Empire from Nothing. Grace read it in their penthouse while he was out with Victoria. She read about how he'd single-handedly revolutionized the luxury real estate market. She read about his unparalleled vision and his innate understanding of what wealthy clients want. She read about how his wife was supportive and a wonderful homemaker. Supportive, wonderful homemaker. as if she hadn't spent 25 years building the actual architecture of his success. That's when Grace understood something crystal clear. This man would never give her credit. This man would never acknowledge her contributions. This man would spend the rest of their lives erasing her, and the world would never know what she'd actually built. So she made a decision. David filed for divorce 3 months later. He served her the papers himself, like he was the one with power to give. His lawyers were confident, even cocky. "She'll get a settlement," they said. "You're the one with the business. That's all in your name. You're going to walk away with everything." David believed them. He started planning his life with Victoria. He was already thinking about the press he'd get, the sympathetic billionaire whose wife couldn't handle his success. He was already rewriting this story. Grace hired her lawyers, but not the divorce specialists everyone expected. She hired the lawyers who handled family business structures, and when she met with them for the first time, she brought documents, old documents, documents from 25 years ago. Here's where the story changes. Here's where the universe decides to balance the scales. In 1999, when Grace and David had married, Grace had transferred her entire family real estate portfolio into a holding company. It was the smart thing to do legally and financially, and because David was her husband and she trusted him, she asked for his advice on how to structure it. David, who understood nothing about complex business structures, suggested they put him as the public face, the CEO, the person who represented the company. It would look better to clients, he said. It would be easier to do business, he said. Grace, because she loved him and because she believed in making him feel important, agreed. But here's the legal truth that David never understood. Putting someone's name on a door doesn't make them own what's behind it. The actual ownership documents, the actual legal structure, the actual property deeds, those were all in Grace's name. She was the beneficiary. She was the owner. She was always the owner. David signed as CEO. David represented the company publicly. David made the decisions, or believed he was making decisions, but every single decision he made was technically made by someone else's company. Every contract he signed had already been authorized by the actual owner. Every deal he thought he was cutting was cut within the legal framework of her empire. For 25 years, David had been playing pretend. He was the king of a kingdom that never belonged to him. When his lawyers reviewed the documents that Grace's lawyers presented, there was silence. The kind of silence that comes before an earthquake. One of the senior partners actually put the documents down and looked at David with something close to pity. "You don't own the company," he said. "You've never owned the company." I want you to really feel what that moment would be like. Imagine finding out, in a single afternoon, that your entire life, your entire legacy, your entire identity, all of it was built on someone else's foundation. Imagine realizing that the person you disrespected, erased, and betrayed was holding your entire future in her hands the whole time. David tried to negotiate. He called Grace directly. He was different on the phone, desperate, pleading. He said they could work something out. He said maybe they didn't need to go through with the divorce. He said maybe things could go back to the way they were. Grace listened, and then she told him that Victoria had called her, that Victoria had admitted to everything, that Victoria had also revealed that David had promised her an engagement ring, promised her a position in the company, promised her a life that wasn't actually his to promise. "So here's what happens," Grace said quietly. "You sign the settlement I'm offering, you receive $15 million, and you disappear. $15 million. Most people would call that winning. But David understood what it really was. It was humiliation. It was being paid to leave his own life. He signed, but the story wasn't over. The lawyers filed the settlement, and the documents became part of the public record. And then the media did what the media does. They started digging. They found the original business documents. They found articles Grace had written for industry publications under her maiden name, articles that contained the exact insights David later presented as his own. They found photographs of business meetings from the late 1990s where a young Grace was present, and they could trace her fingerprints all over the company's evolution. The narrative shifted overnight. David Rothstein went from self-made billionaire to something much worse. He became a man who had stolen his wife's company. He became a man who had spent a quarter-century taking credit for someone else's genius. He became a cautionary tale. Victoria abandoned him. His business associates abandoned him. The press that had loved him suddenly turned vicious. One headline read, "The man who thought his wife was useless, turns out she was everything." Grace, meanwhile, did something brilliant. She didn't hide. She didn't disappear quietly into her settlement. She stepped forward. She gave interviews. She told the truth about what she'd been doing all those years. She shared the strategy, the vision, the work. She showed the world what an invisible genius looks like, and the world responded. Business schools began using her case studies. Entrepreneurs reached out asking for mentorship. Women who'd spent years building their family's wealth while their husbands took the credit saw her story and recognized themselves. Grace rebranded the company. The new name reflected her vision entirely: Johnson Global Luxury Hospitality. She brought in a new team of people who understood that credit matters, that visibility matters, that women's contributions have to be seen and celebrated. She expanded into new markets. She published a book about business strategy and invisible labor. She became a speaker. She became exactly what she should have been all along, the face and the voice of her own empire. 3 years after the divorce was finalized, David tried to start a new venture. He had the connections, he had the capital, he had the experience. But nobody wanted to work with him. Investors ran his background, potential partners read the articles, and they all came to the same conclusion. This is a man who erases the people around him. This is a man who takes credit that isn't his. This is a man who cannot be trusted. The last anyone heard about David Rothstein, he was working as a consultant for a mid-sized real estate firm, not running it, not owning it, consulting. The same position he'd held before he met Grace, except now he was older. His reputation was destroyed, and he was working in a world that would never forget what he'd done. Grace, on the other hand, was unstoppable. She became not just wealthy. She'd always been wealthy. She became visible. She became legendary. She dated someone new, someone who saw her, someone who wasn't threatened by her power. She had a life that was entirely her own. But here's what interests me most about this story. It's not just about what happened to David. It's about what happens when you underestimate the quiet ones. It's about what happens when you mistake someone's kindness for weakness, their support for subservience, their invisibility for irrelevance. Grace wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking recognition. She wasn't trying to destroy David. She was trying to reclaim her own life. And the universe, in its way, made sure that happened. This is what karma actually looks like. It's not dramatic. It's not explosive. It's the slow, inevitable reveal of what was always true. It's the moment when the person you erased stands in front of the world and says, "I was here the whole time." If you're in a relationship where your contributions are being erased, where your ideas are being stolen, where you're being made invisible, pay attention to that. Don't ignore it. Don't hope it gets better. Don't tell yourself you're being noble by staying silent. Some people need the world to teach them what they should have learned at home. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give yourself is the permission to let that lesson be painful. Grace gave David that gift. She let the truth be his teacher. And the world watched as a man who thought he was a genius discovered that he'd actually been working for his wife the entire time. This is a story about power, real power, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't need applause, that knows exactly what it's worth. It's a reminder that the people closest to us, the ones we dismiss, the ones we overlook, the ones we take for granted, they might be holding our entire future in their hands. And if we're not careful, if we're not grateful, if we're not willing to share the credit, the universe has a way of making sure we find out exactly how much we needed them. That's the end of the story. But before you go, I need to ask you something. If this story resonated with you, if you felt the weight of Grace's invisibility and the justice of her emergence, please hit that like button right now. And subscribe to this channel because next week I'm bringing you another story about someone whose silence was strategic, whose patience was weaponized, and whose comeback was absolutely unstoppable. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's someone who's being erased in their own life. Maybe it's someone who needs to understand what it means to truly value the people around them. And drop a comment below. Tell me whose story you want to hear next. Whose comeback are you waiting for? Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, the quiet ones are often the most powerful. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right moment to let the world know.